When stresses are inside of our control, we can do things like intentional problem solving, or it's really important to celebrate small wins. That helps us deal with the stress that we face. It's also really important for us to set and maintain boundaries with ADHD. And I find this particular to us, especially as women. A lot of us, one of the ways we masked or got by with our ADHD was through people pleasing. Because if we made ourselves really useful and other people really liked us, then they would be okay with our ADHD or put up with it or not shame us too bad. Right? I don't know if anyone else noticed that, or maybe you just did it and didn't notice that's what we were doing. But I did it and didn't notice that's what I was doing until more recently. Within the last couple of years, I was like, oh, that's why I did that. But the problem is when we do that, first of all, we end up creating relationships that are really imbalanced with people who just are essentially using us for what we will give them. But also end up saying yes to way more than we could ever handle. And then our own stuff gets put on the back burner, as does our own care.
Hi, I'm Jen Barnes, and you're about to experience how to ditch the old ways of doing things, embrace your neurodivergence, learn tips and tricks to function optimally, and love yourself, neurodivergence and all. Welcome to the Self-Loved Woman podcast.
Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. Today, we're going to talk about an important concept that can really impact anyone. You don't have to be an ADHD woman entrepreneur, but I find that it particularly impacts us and can be easy for us to slip into this, even if we've got an established business or we feel like we have things going. I want to talk today about burnout because I'm seeing a lot of burnout. And actually, I was starting to see signs of it in myself earlier this year. And I was like, whoa, nope, we're not going down that path again because I've been there in the past. And it was definitely hard to get out of and continue to work and do all those things. So today I want to unpack burnout, particularly relevant to the ADHD woman entrepreneur. But even if you don't have ADHD or you have ADHD traits or you're a guy, this one might still be helpful for you. So burnout. Burnout is a word that oftentimes gets tossed around. And from more of a professional kind of clinical perspective, when I'm thinking about burnout, what I'm thinking about is like our nervous system is just fried, right? We're shutting down, we're having low energy, things we used to like, we're not interested in, we're not sleeping well. You might notice if this is you, you might be finding yourself more irritable and having less empathy and compassion. And that can be for your loved ones, but even sometimes, like I'll start to notice that happens with my clients, even like I can catch myself from saying things out loud, but I'll notice more of an internal eye roll, which is obviously a part of me that is burned out or me feeling burned out that is in that place and not being able to access my compassion. But the fact of the matter is when we start to notice these signs, it's important that we recognize it and then do something to stop ourselves from actually getting burned out. Or if maybe we're already there, doing something to stop it from getting worse and shift towards maybe, I want to say healthier way to work, but a more balanced way to live and work so that we're not ending up in this cycle of burnout and then coming back and then burnout and then pushing and then crashing over and over again, which I want to just name. This is a familiar cycle for ADHDers, especially those of us who masked with high achievement, because a lot of us, we learned to overfunction as kids and achieve highly as a way to avoid getting in trouble. Yeah, sure, I'd get yelled at for talking several times an hour in class, but I was given some leeway because I was a quote unquote good student. And some of us, that's how we navigated our ADHD. Now, some of you listening might be like, oh no, Jen, I couldn't get good grades if I wanted to. It's fair. It's everyone's situation is unique. I certainly am aware of some of the privileges I have in my life, both as a white woman, a heterosexual cisgendered woman, coming from a middle class family with a super loving mom who saw that I was struggling. She didn't really know what it was, but she did what she could, right? And that's not common. I also went to a really small school. And yes, it was a Catholic school, so there was a crap ton of shame and anxiety that came out of that. And at the same time, those smaller class sizes probably also helped me be able to focus better and learn. So I want to just name that, like, some of us do have privilege that maybe allowed us to overfunction and highly achieve as a way to mask our ADHD. And you're not bad or wrong. Like you did what you could at the time, right? Remember, growing up with ADHD, a lot of us were just doing what we could figure out to do to get by as children at a time when ADHD wasn't really talked about much at all, but especially not in girls. So, getting back to, though, how that cycle, it does look like burnout, right? Like you push and then you crash, you push and then you crash. I remember being in college and I would just study my butt off. And then, especially finals week, it was like insane. I would come home for breaks and I would be sick, like physically sick every single time. I'd have some nasty head cold, snot-driven thing, like and my mom was always like, "Gosh, whenever you come home, you're always sick. I wanna see you. I wanna spend time with you." And I was like, "I'm just trying to do well in college." And now I realize I was doing that because I had to with my ADHD in order to do well in college. But that's that cycle, and burnout feels very similar to that. It's a very similar feeling. You feel drained, your energy is low, you're not sleeping as well, it's hard to get out of bed in the morning. Like I said, you might feel irritable or like you're lacking empathy and compassion to the same degree you usually have. You might catch yourself collapsing on the couch at the end of the day with little energy to do anything except binge Netflix or whatever streaming you do and doom scrolling social media. Or maybe you're one of those people who's, oh no, I can't commit to a whole Netflix episode, but then scroll TikTok for 4 hours. But either way, right? It's like not having the energy to do anything else. And there's no shame in that. It's just a sign that something's going on. And before we get too far into the burnout conversation, I do want to name something that's really important because a lot of times the person who is burned out oftentimes takes blame for getting burned out. And that's not fair because a lot of times the reason people are getting burned out is because of the systems they're in. I worked with nurses during COVID on burnout, and so much of their burnout was because of the system they were working in. I still taught them things they could do to help themselves, but the fact of the matter is the system they were in at the time sucked. It sucked more than usual. I shouldn't say, to be fair. Medical system in America is not fantastic, at least not for providers and other people working in the system. But I don't know that it's great for patients either all the time. So anyway, my point is that was more of a systemic thing. Yes, there were things they could do, and there were some limiting beliefs keeping them from caring for themselves, but a lot of what they needed is community care. And in terms of ADHD, the problem is we live in a very ableist society that expects everyone to behave the neurotypical way. And when we don't behave the neurotypical way, when our brain doesn't like function that way or we need accommodations, the world like gets frustrated with us or people reject us or yell at us or criticize us or whatever's going on. And then in turn tends to make a lot of us work harder. Some it makes just shut down and give up. Like I get that, right? And some of us just work harder and then we get burned out. And then we're blamed for our burnout when the fact of the matter is the system is broken. And what we really need is community care. And we need people to recognize that each individual human is different. And whether they have ADHD, autism, bipolar disorder, heart disease, they're missing a leg or an arm, or whatever's going on in their life, that they actually require a unique approach to how they're doing things. And I suspect most of us have something. But the fact of the matter is, right now, our society doesn't accommodate for that. And while I will howl at the moon with you about how unfair it is and how we need community care and encourage you to find it where you can get it and learn to advocate for yourself, I also want to say that not caring for yourself to the best of your ability inside of the system you're in while you're waiting for the system to change is pretty destructive. And I say that with love, like I get it. I want those systems to change too, believe me. And the fact of the matter is we can't control that. We don't know the timeline, but we can advocate for ourselves and then do what we need to do with the boundaries we set and the ways we spend our time outside of those systems. So I just want to name that because A lot of times when we talk about burnout, people are like, "Oh, here we go. I'm gonna be blamed for being burned out again or told it's my responsibility." And I just wanna be clear, like, it's not that simple. This is a complex issue that requires so many broken systems in our society. In no way by talking about burnout and caring for yourself and healing your burnout am I saying that you are the sole one responsible. What I am saying is that you're the only thing you can control. And so it's like, I mean, you can do what you can with what you got, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about what to do with those things that are out of control. But first, I want to talk a bit more about burnout itself. We've talked about the experience of burnout. And the thing is you may have tried things like sleeping more, or maybe you amped up your self care, right? But you're still like just not able to cut it. And the thing is because the problem isn't just the burnout. Like I said, the problem is some of these systemic issues. And if we want to feel better sooner rather than later, that means that it would be beneficial for us to figure out how to do that. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, the first thing I want to talk about is the nervous system and how burnout shows up in the body is what I want to say. Like how it shows up in the body, and the nervous system plays a huge role in this. And so I talk a lot about the nervous system, but in the event that this is the first episode you've ever heard from me, I'm going to just brush over the autonomic nervous system a bit. For those of you that have heard this, it'll be great review or maybe not. So hang in there with me. Maybe I should shout loudly when I'm done or say the word pickle. I don't know. That came to me because I was out of pickles for lunch. Anyway, random ADHD moment. So here we go. The thing is, we all have what's called the autonomic nervous system, and there's three main parts to it, especially when you look at it from a sense of polyvagal theory, which was developed by Stephen Porges. And I want to name that these three parts all have like different roles in our system. They're not only to help us with survival. However, they all have a role in our survival, and a very unique role at that. So, the first one I'm going to talk about is our ventral vagal response, which is when we feel safe enough to connect, rest, and digest. And so that's important to our survival because we need our body to function optimally. We need to be able to connect, right? Especially if you think historically, like when humans were first coming around, we needed to stay with our tribe, and even mammals needed to stay with their fellow family or whatever they had in order to stay safe because there was safety in numbers at the time. And so the ventral vagal response does have a safety aspect, but it's one that is more done in that state of homeostasis where we feel pretty chill, but maybe the ventral vagal response isn't necessarily one of like deep relaxation because that tends to be a blended state with dorsal vagal and ventral vagal, which I'm not going to get into, but these states can be blended too. But more it's like a state of flow where you're aware, you're alert, but you're also not like super intensely anxious or stressed, right? You're just feel safe enough to connect, rest, and digest, like I said. When your brain perceives a threat, and I say your brain because it happens outside of your awareness. When there is a perceived threat in a very short amount of time, you are flooded with hormones like adrenaline, noradrenaline, also known as norepinephrine, and cortisol. And what those do is they help you with the fight or flight process and coming down from it. And the thing is that's important to remember because that's going to play a key role when we talk about how we get burned out. So this idea that we have cortisol, noradrenaline or norepinephrine, and adrenaline flooding into our body to help us fight or flee is essential to understanding burnout. But before we go there, I want to share that when all hope is lost, when we're unable to fight or flee, what will happen is our nervous system's like, well, looks like the end. Let's shut it down. And it's like a giving up so that your nervous system is actually trying to protect you from the pain of a painful death, right? Essentially, or whatever bad is going to happen to you that you might survive, but who knows, right? With the shutdown response, with the dorsal vagal shutdown response, there is a numbing of physical pain and even emotional pain to some degree. You might still feel things, but not as deeply. And that state can look more like depression or numbing out or dissociation Whereas like the fight or flight response, if you're chronically in that, that'll feel more like irritability and anxiety and anger and restlessness, reactivity, that kind of thing. And so these states have different ways of being in them, and it might feel unique to you. So, like in my program Ascend, we take time to figure out, like, what does that feel like to you? So, you might take some time. What does it feel like to you to be in that fight or flight response? What does that feel like? What does it feel like to be in the shutdown response? So that you can notice when you're there and then choose to regulate out of it when it's safe enough to do so. Those are the 3 responses that we're gonna talk about. Like I said, we can have blended states. The states are also involved in other things, like we need our dorsal vagal response for digestion. So it's not so clean and cut and simple. So if I have any like neuroscientists or doctors, I don't want them to be like, actually, Jen, the dorsal vagal response does more than just that. And so I just want to make sure I'm speaking accurately, but also we're not going to go into all that for our purposes to talk about burnout. You heard me say that it is important to remember about those chemicals getting flooded in for the fight or flight response, right? Here's the thing. A guy named Peter Levine has researched a lot on trauma, actually, but he's also researched what happens with the autonomic nervous system. And specific to this, he's researched polar bears. So he went along with people who were tagging polar bears, and they would from the plane, they would drop a net over the polar bear or something like that. And then they get down closer and they would use a trank dart to temporarily tranquilize the polar bear. And then they would tag the polar bear's ear so they could track the bear and actually learn more about polar bears and then take maybe, I don't know if they do things to take care of them or what happens there, but they were doing that. And Peter Levine was there. And as they were going away, he watched what happened to the bears, right? Because they are forced into essentially a shutdown response. They cannot fight or flee. But when they're initially netted, the tranquilizer isn't immediate. So there is a flooding of cortisol, adrenaline, and noradrenaline that they get, but then they can't use it. And so Peter Levine was particularly interested in what happened there. And so what he saw is as they were going away, they would take the net off, but the tranquilizer was still active, which was good because you don't want a polar bear coming after you just take their ear. They're pretty fierce animals, even though they look cute. But as they would fly overhead, what Peter Levine witnessed was the polar bear, as the tranquilizer was wearing off, would be like fighting and running and essentially using up that energy, that those hormones, the cortisol, noradrenaline, and adrenaline, in order to complete the fight or flight response. Because that energy was stuck in the polar bear's body and it had to get it out because it didn't use it to fight or flee. So instinctually, it knew to do that. And probably at one point, humans instinctually knew to do that too. But the problem is that's not what our lives are like anymore. Very little of our lives are connected to the natural world and how we would function instinctively anymore. And so instead, what do? We have a stressful day. We come home and we do what? You probably know, we sit. We have a stressful day and we come home and we sit. And we do not use those chemicals from the fight or flight response. And they build up in our body. And it's that buildup over time that eventually causes burnout. It's a big piece of it. And not to mention, over time, if we are chronically in our fight or flight response or shutdown response, or bouncing back and forth between the two, and we're not getting into our ventral vagal response where our organs and other systems function optimally, we can end up with bigger problems. Because when you are in your protective responses trying to get to safety, your body deprioritizes things like your reproductive system, your digestive system, your endocrine system. I mean, your endocrine system works a little bit because of the hormones coming in, but your immune system. And so the functions of the body that are needed to keep you healthy essentially are compromised. And so over time, if you're stuck in that fight or flight response or shutdown response or bouncing back and forth between the two, you can end up with a lot like things like chronic illness, chronic fatigue syndrome, all kinds of autoimmune disorders, which we see is really common in survivors of complex trauma. There's a reason why their ACEs scores, their adverse childhood experience scores, when they're high, is linked to poor health outcomes. And to me, if they don't feel safe in the world, they're bouncing back and forth between their fight or flight response and their shutdown response. not really getting ventral all that often. And so they're not really getting to that place where their body can heal itself or fight off the flu bug or feel regulated. And so then chronic illness starts to form and develop. And in some ways, it's the body's way of saying, I need help, do something. It's just that our society hasn't really recognized until very recently that there's even a connection there. So that is what can happen in its most extreme if we don't handle this, which is why we're going to talk about what to do today. So when we talk about working with burnout, the first step, of course, we want to continue working on community care, like I said, but the first step is finding ways to daily complete the stress response, to daily release those hormones that were put into the body to help you get to safety, to help you survive. And the best way to do that, as you might imagine, is with movement. It's recommended to do 30 minutes of movement a day because that will help release those chemicals, those hormones from the body. And it doesn't have to be 30 consecutive minutes, and it doesn't have to be like going to a gym. I do Zumba in my garage. There's that. It can even be going for 3 10-minute walks in the day, which if you have a dog, you're probably doing that anyway because they like to go outside. Although if they're like sniff walks, that might, I don't know if that counts or not. You'll have to see how you feel doing that, if that's enough. But still, getting in 30 minutes of movement, that will help you move those hormones through the body to complete the stress response. There's actually 7 that I teach in Ascend, but just for the sake of brevity, so we're not here all day, I'm going to share 3 more. And movement is the best one because it mimics what you're supposed to do with those hormones, right? You're supposed to fight or flee, you're supposed to move. But there's actually more that can help us. One is breathing. And I'm sure you're like, shucker, Jen, absolute shucker. Paying attention, like breathing intentionally can help you because it turns out that when your breath is regulated, that's actually a cue of safety to your nervous system. Because if you're not safe in the moment, your breath cannot be full or slow or deep. It will be short because you're trying to fight or flee. Like you won't be able to slow down your breath if you're actually in danger. I don't want you to try that, by the way. If a bear is chasing you, don't all of a sudden stop and try and do some pranayama from yoga to get yourself to see if it works. So no, get yourself away from the bear. But in all honesty, the point is breathing can really help. So when it's safe enough to do so, you can invite in breathing. And oh my gosh, there's a gazillion breathing techniques. The one that's just the quickest to share about is like square breathing, where you breathe in for 4, hold for 1, breathe in for 4, hold for 1. And I can demo that with you. But the first thing I want to say is the biggest mistake most people make when they work on their breath is they try and force the breath immediately into whatever technique they're doing. I find that to be a huge mistake and why a lot of people struggle with breath work. Instead, start with your natural breath, wherever it is in that moment, and just notice it for a couple breaths and be like, oh, okay. And then slowly invite it to shift. You can do this for a moment now. If you're driving, still pay attention. If you're doing something, operating heavy machinery, please still focus on that. Maybe just skip this exercise for now. You can come back to it. I'm not going anywhere. I'm on recording. But you might just pause and notice your breath. And as long as you're not operating heavy machinery, you could do that with your eyes closed. You could do that with your eyes open. And you might just notice your breath as it is. There doesn't need to be any judgment, just an awareness. And perhaps inviting your breath to shift. So you might invite your breath to slow. You might invite it to slow so that maybe you're breathing in for a count of 4, 3, 2, 1. And then maybe you're breathing out for a count of 4, 3, 2, 1. And you're welcome to count to any number and to count at any pace. But you might be inviting your breath to shift. And if you might notice that you breathe in for 4, 3, 2, 1, maybe holding, and then maybe breathing out for 4, 3, 2, 1, and perhaps holding. You might allow yourself to breathe this way, maybe another cycle or 2. perhaps starting to notice what it feels like in your body. I notice that I feel a lot more regulated. I definitely feel a lot more that ventral vagal state where I feel safe enough to connect, rest, and digest. I feel alert, aware, and yet in more of a state of flow, very clear and focused, but yet from more of a place of groundedness and calm. You can probably even hear it in my voice, right? Because I tend to be very animated when I speak. But if I ever speak right after I've done some yoga or some breath work, I tend to slow down and I tend to be even more present than I usually am. And so you might even hear it in me, but you might also notice it in yourself. So the breath is another way to complete the stress response and is an important practice because you will always have that with you. Another one is a decent hug. People call it other things, but I call it a decent hug because really it's like a 20-second, no holds barred hug. Both of you are leaning together into each other. It's not one of you holding the other one up, but you're leaning into each other, breathing together 20 seconds. And I suggest only doing this with someone that you love or trust, like probably not a random stranger. I don't know if it would work that way. I have tried it with trees. They tend to be pretty awesome at this. I've actually found it helpful. I don't know if it fully completes the stress response, but it definitely feels more grounding after. But to really lean in, breathe, and hug for 20 seconds, breathing together and just being and receiving and giving at the same time, that can help complete the stress response. And the last one I'll share today is a good hard cry. It turns out that we release all kinds of good stuff when we have a good hard cry, and doing so helps us complete the stress response. So if you're struggling and you're feeling burned out and you want to cry about it, I say let yourself, because having a good hard cry will help you with that. I do want to say if you're coming home after work and crying every single day, this may not always be the thing you want to do. If it's helping you, by all means. But if it feels like it's dragging you down, then it might not actually be helping at some point. And then that's up to you to kind of say, maybe I need to find another option for completing the stress response. You can still cry. I'm not in any way discouraging you from feeling your feelings. It's just that sometimes the reason we're crying is because we're looped into our thoughts versus genuinely feeling our feelings. Sometimes it's both. You do you, and also try and get a sense of what is useful for you, right? So those are the ways I'm going to share right now that help us complete the stress response. And if you're really wanting to feel better when you're burned out, it's essential that you prioritize this daily. Super important. So one of the things I want to talk about too, and it's relevant to this idea of overwhelm, because that's a word that gets tossed around a lot everywhere, but especially in ADHD circles is I'm overwhelmed, especially in entrepreneur circles. And I want to talk about that word. And I want to talk about how we deal with when we actually are in overwhelm versus when we're really stressed, because it's a difference. And this comes straight from Brene Brown, from her talks that she's done on Atlas of the Heart, her book, which is essentially like an encyclopedia of all 86 emotions that she identified. I think it was 86. If it's 89, I was close. But anyway, basically, here's the thing. The words we use to identify the feeling experience we're having matter because there is a neurobiological response based on what that word means. And there is a huge difference between stress and overwhelm. And I'm going to use her example because it's so beautiful, so perfect that I just think this does it really well. So stressed is like when you have a lot on your plate and you can do it. You still have your head above water. You can still keep track of things, but you're feeling stressed. So Brene used to work in the restaurant industry and she worked for a very busy restaurant. And when they were stressed, they would come into the kitchen and say, I'm in the weeds. And that meant I've got a lot going on. I'm still doing it, but I could use some extra hands right now. And so they would say, I'm in the weeds. I need someone to take waters to table 1, dessert to table 6, and please greet table 5. I don't even know if that's how servers talk, but like basically that's the idea. And so you're still able to function when you're stressed, right? Overwhelm, you heard me take a big breath because overwhelm is a whole different story. Overwhelm is your shot, right? It's just like you're done. That's the coming home. That's the burnout. That's the coming home. You're so exhausted, you plop on the couch, you can barely do anything except binge Netflix and scroll social media. That's overwhelm, right? It's burnout, it's overwhelm. They're not exactly the same thing, but they can look similar. And what they would do in that kitchen when someone was overwhelmed, they'd come back and they'd go, I'm blown, which by the way is like the perfect. I mean, this is so brilliant that this restaurant knew to do this, whoever created it there. But I'm blown meant that they were completely non functional. And so someone would actually take their server pad from them because they didn't trust that they had clear enough thinking in overwhelm to even know what tables they had. So someone would come in and just take over for them. And then they were instructed to leave for 10 minutes and do nothing, not sit on their phone, but do nothing. They could not be in the restaurant or in the kitchen, except in the freezer. They could be in the freezer, which I always say that might sound nice in Houston, where Brene is. In Minnesota, it depends on the season if that's a good idea. But basically, when you're in overwhelm, it requires doing nothing for 10 minutes at least. And if you've ever felt truly overwhelmed, you know this. I've got someone in my program who, when she's overwhelmed, she goes straight to a blanket burrito. And it's like her system knows, right? Her system's, yep, we're done. We need to do nothing for a little bit so we can come back. And the connection this has to burnout is very similar because in a lot of ways, you do need some nothingness. You do need some space to rest. But the problem is a lot of us rest with things that aren't actually restful. This is going to be probably an unpopular thing to say, but like social media, well, not so restful. Seriously, be honest with yourself. Binging Netflix, not so restful. Unless you watch documentaries of kittens or something, I don't know, that are all alive the whole time and happy and well fed and whatever. I'm not sure. I'm not here to judge, but also drinking wine, not restful. It's numbing and it might help you feel better in the short term. But if we're really honest with ourselves, those things are not actually helping us replenish what we've lost from being overwhelmed and even from being burned out. And so then what do we do? What do we do when we're burned out? It's important that we do find ways to take care of ourselves at work. And I'm not going to preach at you about self-care. By now, I know you know what you need to do. It's a matter of figuring out how to do it. And that might be something that you can do on your own. It might be something you need some coaching for, which, by the way, if you need it, for sure, reach out. But you know what you need to do to take care of yourself. And I trust that you have the ability to seek out whatever resources you need to do that for yourself when you're ready, willing and able, I should say, when you're ready, willing and able. And there's also some things we can do to manage our stress to keep from getting to burnout. So the first thing I want to talk about is stressors that are out of our control. And I want to share about 2 ways to deal with stressors that are outside of our control. And some of this is the systems that we deal with. The systems are outside of our control. I'll share a recent example of something that was out of my control. So my family was up at the cabin for Memorial Day weekend, and my dad ended up in the hospital. He's fine, but he was in the hospital, and that was none of our choices. So my sister and I went to the ER with him, and like I said, he's fine now. But we went to the ER with him, and so from, I don't know, 3 o'clock till 8:30 or 8:15, something like that, while we're supposed to be at the cabin enjoying things after cleaning all morning, we were in the hospital, which wasn't fun. And then the next day we went back to the hospital. And then that evening we went back to the hospital. And then the next day we sat with him until he was released and brought him home. So none of that was our first choice, but none of it was something we could change. And so here's where radical acceptance comes in. Radical acceptance is the idea that when we can radically accept our reality, you know what? Yeah, this is the reality of the situation, so that we can spend our energy focusing on what we can do. Because a lot of times, I'm not saying it's not valid to sit with your feelings for as long as you need to. You get to be angry or frustrated or whatever. More than anything, I think we were scared, to be honest. But to sit with those feelings for a little bit. And then I noticed, I think my sister did it too. I didn't ask her, but there's just this kind of sense of like, all right, this is just what's happening. This is just the reality right now. And we can't control this. So what do we need to do to be here? What needs to get deprioritized? How do we do this? And when someone's in the hospital, it's a lot easier because it's pretty much that's your clear priority. So that has maybe have been too easy an example, but it's quite frankly the first thing that came to my head. So here we go. but it's okay. This is the reality. And so when we can do that in a situation that isn't our first choice, then we're free to problem solve. So my sister and I were like, okay, he's here another night. That's just how it is. What are we going to do? And because neither of us was like bitching about the fact that he was in the hospital or freaking out that he was in the hospital, we are like, okay, how are we going to handle this? What are we going to do? Now, I do want to say it wasn't life threatening what was going on. So maybe that could have also helped our ability to get here faster. But because we radically accepted the reality of the situation, that our plans were different than expected, then we were able to just deal with it super effectively, and it became just what it was, right? And we enjoyed the time with our dad as much as we could. So that's an example of radical acceptance. The other thing we can do when we're faced with stressors that are outside of our control is something called positive reappraisal. And this one I want to name is not looking on the bright side. It's not everything happens for a reason. It's more this idea that this thing that sucks happened and I'm learning this from it. So in some ways, the difficulty might be worth it in some way. Not ideal. Like I said, it's not everything happens for a reason or look on the bright side. It's more of a like, okay, if I'm going to be stuck in traffic, then I'm going to listen to the radio and have time to listen to my favorite radio station because a lot of times I don't get time for that. Or like when I broke my arm in, oh my gosh, what year was that? Wasn't 2020. It couldn't have been 2020. Maybe it was 2020. Huh. Seems like it was a bad year to break my arm. Yeah, it wasn't 2021. So there you go. It was 2020, but I broke my arm and that's not my first choice. Thankfully, I have good medical care. So I have some privilege there that helped save me. And I still couldn't use my arm, which was a problem because I need to type for work. It was not good. And I could sit and be pissed about it and rage about it and whatever. And I did feel my feelings about it and I worked through them. But eventually I got to the point of, okay, you know what? This is my body's way of telling me to slow down. This is some time for me to do things more intentionally, more mindfully. This is a time for me to sit down and look at all those things I've said I do and figure out what actually needs to happen given that I'm moving slower. And so it was a time of paring down for me when I really needed that. And sure, I would have rather have either figured that out without breaking my arm or just have gone on how I was going on was just fine with me. However, that was not what was in the cards. So it's like, all right, if I have this broken arm, I'm going to notice at least like what I'm getting out of it. Not to invalidate the feelings though, because those are important. So those are some of the ways we can deal with stressors that are outside of our control. When stresses are inside of our control, we can do things like intentional problem solving, or it's really important to celebrate small wins. That helps us deal with the stress that we face. It's also really important for us to set and maintain boundaries with ADHD. And I find this particular to us, especially as women. A lot of us, one of the ways we masked or got by with our ADHD was through people pleasing. Because if we made ourselves really useful and other people really liked us, then they would be okay with our ADHD or put up with it or not shame us too bad. Right? I don't know if anyone else noticed that, or maybe you just did it and didn't notice that's what we were doing, but I did it and didn't notice that's what I was doing until more recently. Within the last couple of years, I was like, oh, that's why I did that. But the problem is when we do that, first of all, we end up creating relationships that are really imbalanced with people who just are essentially using us for what we will give them. But also end up saying yes to way more than we could ever handle. And then our own stuff gets put on the back burner, as does our own care. And then we end up burned out, right? So one of the pieces of burnout, believe it or not, is being more intentional about what we say yes to and learning how to say no. And part of learning how to say no is going to figure out, how do you cope with someone being mad at you? How do you cope with someone rejecting you? How do you cope with someone who might be like, if you're not going to do this for me, then I don't want to be your friend, which is hard. I get. And I know for a part of you, you're like, oh my God, that's terrible. But I suspect that there's an adult part inside of you, even your self energy, that recognizes that if someone's only your friend because of what you do for them, they're not really your friend. I know you know that. And yet there's younger parts of us that don't know that, which is why it's so scary to tell people no, right? Because we're afraid of losing people that these younger parts of us think are our friend. part of the burnout equation is learning to set boundaries and learning to get comfortable with what happens when we do. All right, y'all. That was a pretty fast, deep dive on burnout. I hope you found it helpful. And if you're struggling with this and you need some help, you're welcome to. Right now, I have a coaching special going on. I'm offering one-to-one coaching at a hugely discounted rate. I'm working on my ICF certification, which is the next level of coaching certification. And so I need 8 people to do 10 sessions or fewer people to do less than 10 sessions. But right now I have a really good deal going on for coaching. So if you're wanting some one-on-one coaching to work with your ADHD, whether it's for your business or not, or you want to work on burnout or something else, I am more than happy to do that with you. I want you to know because I am a certified coach, I'm able to use IFS, internal family systems, the parts work inside of my coaching practice. So if that is something that interests you, working with the deeper parts of you that are keeping you stuck, that's something else I can also help you with. So I will share in the show notes how to get signed up for that. And if you're not following already, please follow and be sure to share. Thank you so much and take care.